Thanks. Well, um, but what about what about his later work? You know, the philosophical investigations, because that seems to have been that seems to have been something that has caused so many people to deal with certain facets of it. And to me, it's, begging your pardon, it's more alive. I mean, it seems like people are still dealing with it, not in an abstract, this is what we think he was saying, but also, no matter what he said the limits of philosophy were, it just seemed like it opened up a lot of avenues.
Well, one reason I was referring back to some of those other articles is I mean, I don't have any support for this, but it seems to me that the early Wittgenstein was mostly analytical with a little bit of continental thoughts mixed in there, and the philosophical investigation seems to be, I mean, it is much closer to continental philosophy, or maybe it's some mixture or hybrid of the two. So it seems like he moved from mostly analytical. I mean, the Trochtatus to me does not seem to be as bound by mathematics and logic as Bertrand Russell does, but nevertheless, it's really heavily skewed that way. But the philosophical investigations seem to have moved significantly away from that. And so one reason I was, if Jackson wanted to look at some analytic stuff, one reason I was suggesting some of those others is because I'm wondering if the philosophical investigations, I don't know, maybe if it's Jackson that's mostly interested in this, maybe he should make that judgment. But I was wondering if maybe the philosophical investigations was actually moving too far afield of the analytic tradition to scratch that itch.
I'll be fine. I have Dr. Peter Hutchinson next semester, so I have that. But yeah, I mean, all four of us have nodded in agreement to philosophical investigation, so that's a contender right there,
I mean, it's a book. I mean, maybe it's just because I've already read the Trochtatus, although again, I don't think I understood much of it, but I'm kind of like with Ed. If you just pick up I've had a copy of the philosophical investigations for probably 15 years and have never read it. But if you just pick it up and kind of skim through it, it's like, this is kind of interesting. Where when I pick up the Trochtatus, it's like, oh God. And most of it, there's a few.
There's some really good stuff in here, man. There's
a few things that caught my interest, but
like the whole like end section of 6, I think, is definitely worth reading, where like he says that like in 6.54, my propositions are elucidatory in this way: he who understands me finally recognizes them as senseless when he has climbed out through them, on them, over them. He must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up on it. He must surmount these propositions, then he sees the world rightly. That's what does that mean? That's so poetic. It's like, it is kind of going, it's worth reading, but yeah, I think more discussion oriented would be philosophical investigations, though you might get bored with it because he keeps bringing up different points. Because
I mean, that's why I said the Trochtatus to me seems to be less pure analytic philosophy than someone like Bertrand Russell. I mean, to be honest, sometimes I say that what ruined Western philosophy was when mathematicians got into it, which was Frege, Bertrand Russell, and Wittgenstein. Although to be honest though, what's his name? Phenomenology guy, Husserl. Husserl was a mathematician, and Husserl began his philosophical project with an analysis of mathematics, like Frege did, but then he ended up in phenomenology. So it's not really fair to say that. In fact, I've got another book I haven't read called Husserl or Frege, which compares their mathematical philosophies and sort of shows how they kind of moved into different directions that became, phenomenology on the one hand and analytic philosophy on the other. So that's a really unfair That's just me being crabby. But there is a lot of, I mean, there's a fair amount of formalism in the Trochtatus as I'm skimming through, you know, for every X, f of X, and you know, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, because
Doesn't excite me.
it it interpolates. Like I said, it's not all of it. Yeah, there's quite a few parts of it, but there's also a lot where it there it is. Yeah. Because I mean, the biggest thing for him in this in the Tractatus is that he was trying to deconstruct the essence of language, and then he thought he could understand it by exposing some common element, and that was like his big thing in that one. And then an essential component of exposing that is like a system of symbolic logic and rules that is this underlying structure, that if you can get to the underlying structure like you talked about, then you can start getting to the root of all language. And he felt he kind of had found or deconstructed everything into these series of propositions. And then later on in philosophical investigations, he was like, I got all of that wrong. And there's still some themes in the Tractatus that are really relevant. But the biggest thing for him was that you need to have an examination of language. It has to reveal itself in a series of interrelated structures. And that language is not this, it doesn't operate by like these rule governed patterns that he had in the Tractatus. It's more like you have to uncover the rules of language in grammar, and it's multifaceted. It has to be a process, it has to be flexible, and every culture, every environment, every interaction can have some type of language game associated with it that's worth analyzing. But again, I think the biggest thing for him is that when you start getting into rigid conceptual structures, they offer like a false picture, almost like a barrier to the truth. So I can't remember where in philosophical investigations he starts talking about the fly in the bottle. I think it was like 305 or 304. When you start having this concept of like extremely rigid structures, you're creating your own prisons in a way, and the fly is stuck in here, and when we get into ontology and meaning and trying to fit things that don't apply in certain scenarios. Did my video just cut?
No, I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
You froze for a second, but your words were coming out.
Okay, I have to see. It would be like, let's say, you know, we have these rules for ontology and we have these rules for being. Let's say I had a rule for the word circle, right? And the rule is a closed curve in which each point on the curve is equidistant from the midpoint. You know, and that's just the rule for what we mean by circle. And that works good in geometry, but when you have a kid drawing circles on a piece of notepad, you know, how do we take that rule and kind of flex it? I mean, we know that he means a circle. We can identify circle. And then even more so, like, how are you going to come to terms of what you mean by circle when you use phrases like, I'm arguing in a circle? Like, I think what he's trying to say in the investigation is that when you try to stretch or amend the rule and start trying to apply an exactness, that kind of has an infinite level of gyrations to make sure that that rule gives it a kind of some type of responsibility for meaning. And when you start doing that, it's infinite. I mean, it goes into what Derrida says, where you're just trying to have this constant stretching of this rule means that. You can get into the logical atavism aspect and throw it into truth tables, and this means here, and then we have to expound it here, like the logical positivists try to do. And that doesn't necessarily apply. We start getting into this baggage that gets to be thrown into situations where they don't belong because we're trying to extend our rules. Whereas I think what Wittgenstein was trying to say is that he wants to let the use determine the meaning of certain things, and that the use of how we talk in analyzing language is like the nature of all of our philosophical problems. And if we can get into having the flexibility of the tool of use, then we can find ways to get out of the traps or the philosophical prisons that we create in the process.
Well, right. I mean, that's his whole point, is that so much of language is contextual, and there's multiple contexts, and these contexts aren't going to ever be finished, because human knowledge, human experience, human invention is going to create new things. And so, imagine 300 years ago. I'm just thinking of my vocabulary, I mean, and I don't like to use it, but input, output, not so much output, but input. Um, and we use mechanical and electrical terms in our thought, in our statements, that we would never use before. I mean, to me, Wittgenstein was open to I don't want to call it the movement of thought, but the multiplicity of avenues of thought from what already existed. And that it's if you can't have a mathematical system that encompasses everything, because that's just not how the world is, especially with human beings in it. Isn't mathematics, since I'm going out of my league, but a closed system? And the whole idea of the human experience is how open it is.
Yeah, like language is meaningful in its imprecision, I think, is what he's getting at. Language is meaningful in its imprecision. And that's what we have to get away from it. The more you try to, and the big thing for him is that we confuse exactness with the tool that we're using to measure, which is why there seems to be this false kind of idea of there needs to be a requirement for precision that just simply needs to stop. Like the only way to stop this problem for him is to simply not start it. There has to be you can't define concepts in like a vacuum. And once you start using logical atomism or atomism, and start defining things in a completely analytic tradition where it has to be precise in our meanings, you're not allowing for the flexibility of language to determine its actual concept and idea.
One of the things that I found interesting, going back to the Trochtatus, at least the Stanford article on it, was toward the end when I forgot who the authors are, but when the authors are talking about these tensions in the Trochtatus, and one of them, and these differences of interpretation, and one of those differences of interpretation has to do with realism. To what degree is Wittgenstein's Trochtatus trying to be a system of reference? And let me read this paragraph, which I thought was pretty fascinating. Oh crap, now I can't find it. But the idea that it's the sentence where he said that language, the world, and logic are homomorphic. They have this, oh, here we go. Oh, never mind. And so, since he's analyzing language, but language purports to be describing states of affairs. And so there's at least from the way I read this article, there's ambiguity in, well, here's a paragraph. All propositions are of equal value. That could also be the fundamental thought of the book, for it employs a measure of the value of propositions that is done by logic and the notion of limits. It is here, however, with the constraints on the value of propositions, that the tensions in the Trochtatus is most strongly felt. It becomes clear that the notions used by the Trochtatus, the logical philosophical notions, do not belong to the world, and hence cannot be used to express anything meaningful. Since language, thought, and the world are all isomorphic, any attempt to say in logic, that is in language, this and this there is the world, that there is not, is doomed to failure, since it would mean that logic has got outside the limits of the world, that is, of itself. That is to say, the Trochtatus has gone over its own limits and stands in danger of being nonsensical. So, part of I thought was fascinating is that by, it's when I was reading this stuff from the Stanford Encyclopedia, Wittgenstein reminded me a lot of Hume, in the sense that, Hume's standpoint is all I have access to are my mental perceptions. And so, there's some people read Hume as being an idealist and saying that there is no material world, but that doesn't seem to fit with his text. The way I read Hume is him saying, the only thing I have access to are these mental perceptions, and therefore I'm just not going to talk about the world because I have no access to it. The only thing I have access to are these mental perceptions right here. Like I hold up my water bottle in class and I say, this is not a water bottle. This is a mental perception of a water bottle. And so Hume's like, I'm just not going to talk about the bottle because I have no access to it. And then it sounds like in the Trochtatus, Wittgenstein is saying something similar in the sense that the only thing I have access to is language. And so I'm going to talk about language. But then it seems like part of the ambiguity that these different interpretations break from is that it's unclear whether he has this sort of pseudo-Humean position where he's saying the only thing we can talk about is stuff we can talk about. And so let's not worry about whether language actually refers to real things in the world. Let's just talk about language and let's just call that reality because that's all we can do. I don't know if there's a world, or I can't prove there's a world, or I can't prove that this language refers. All I can do is literally talk about language. And so then it becomes sort of ontologically skeptical and reserves judgment about whether the language refers or not. But then there are these realists who point I think they said to the very first sentence of the Trochtatus, where he says, what is it? Is something is all that the state of affairs is all that, I can't remember. Joseph, do you remember what the first sentence of well, I have it right here.
The world is all that there is. Let me
the world is all that is the case, or something like that.
The world is all that is the case, and
and so there's the realists point to that and say, oh no, he is talking, the world is all that is the case. The world is the totality of fact. But then the very next sentence, the world is the totality of facts, not of things. And so the realists point to the first sentence and say the world is all that is the case, and saying he is talking about the world. But then what about the next sentence? The world is the totality of facts, not of things. And the facts are things that are expressible linguistically. And so that's one of the things I find, one of the most fascinating things I find out about, this article mentioned about the Trochtatus, is how Wittgenstein seems to be trying to occupy that in-between skeptical state between realism and not idealism, but realism and skepticism, maybe. Like for Hume, it was, he was saying all I can experience are my mental perceptions. I can't experience the world apart from my mental perceptions. Whereas Wittgenstein seems to be saying the only thing I can make meaning about are things I can talk about. And so let's not there's no way for us to know whether the things we talk about are literally referring to a physical world independently of our linguistic constructions. Anyway, I thought that, I think, is a fascinating place to kind of hang out, is in that little in-between space, which sounds like part of what he's trying to do in the Trochtatus. But then again, that's probably a particular interpretation.
Yeah, because for him, the existence or non-existence of something is an empirical question, not a conceptual one. So like for me, like let's say, for example, like somebody tells us avoid the oaks with evil spirits in it, right? Are we going to go into some type of what's the word I'm looking for? It's not sociological, it's something else where you study cultures. Jackson, help me out.
Anthropological.
Anthropological. Thank you very much, all of you. Appreciate it. It's really, he's not concerned with the anthropological aspect or the sociological issue, but he is concerned with why the tribe of that culture would have some idea of like what do we need to put into context of that culture to have that sentence make sense so that we can start analyzing our own language. It's not so much that we're talking about the ontology of spirits or if there's even spirits in a tree, because for the Welsh, they may think that, evil spirits in trees are when a tree starts dying, that an evil spirit's inhabiting into it, and that's not what you want to make wood for lumber. So for Wittgenstein, he's less interested in the anthropological and more interested in finding out a context for setting up how certain concepts can make sense and then use that to start making sense of our own language. It's like the concept of the language game for him.
What I wonder, and again, you know Wittgenstein much better than I do. But I mean,
no, I don't.
Oh,
no, I don't.
Sure
No. Let's just set that expectation right now. I am a blundering stumbler here.
And this may just be the author's interpretation in the Stanford article, but they argued a few times that maybe I should say, and maybe they're in this camp, there are people who think there's more of a continuity between the Trochtatus and the philosophical investigations than other people. And I'm wondering, maybe part of it is that, and again, I don't know, I'm just saying stuff, I don't know if it's true or not, but it sounds like like in the Trochtatus, it really is still about the language game, because that, again, if this idea that I seem to have pulled out of this article is true, that he's kind of hanging in this skeptical space between realism and skepticism without trying to really commit one way or the other, then I'm wondering if the Trochtatus really is about a language game. But the main difference is, as you've been saying, Joseph, that in the Trochtatus, he tries to reduce the language game to formal logical structures with clear boundaries, whereas in the philosophical investigations, he's decided that's not really how language works, and so that's not. But it's still like a thoroughly logical, analytical language game, as opposed to this language game based on use and culture and so on.
Yeah, I certainly feel like in the Tractatus, he tried to define concepts in a vacuum, whereas in philosophical investigations, it was more like he was trying to recognize that the meaningfulness is in the precision, the fabric nature of games. You're not going to be able to define any concepts in a vacuum where it's always going to be applicable. And when you start doing that, you're creating a problem. I think that's what he was saying, is that his approach is the more narrow he got with defining concepts, the more problems he created in the Tractatus rather than in philosophical investigation.
But I can understand, given the time he was working through all of that, why he may have thought that was a fruitful approach. I mean, when you think of the advances in physics, which my understanding is, it's because advances in mathematics, that they just had much more powerful mathematics than they had 200 years earlier. And so it's like, okay, if they can, physicists, chemists, whatever, can have this kind of precision, then could we start, I mixed metaphors, but like a coral reef, if we can agree on certain meanings of certain words as a bedrock from which we can build, then that's the way to go, right? Because then we do have this agreement, we do have this, it's more than intersubjective, right? I mean, or it's intersubjective to the point that it's accepted by, for the sake of argument, everybody. And then and once we do that, well then, okay, then let's keep on adding.
I think that's absolutely true. And in fact, when I was in grad school at UT, we had to take a class in analytic philosophy and a class in continental philosophy, which were both surveys. And my recollection is they pretty much said that explicitly, that part of the entrance of mathematicians into philosophy, which then became, at least in one branch, analytic philosophy, part of that movement was explicitly an attempt to make philosophy as rigorous as science for exactly the reasons you cite. That the success of the physical sciences was so astounding and so rapid that there were, like these mathematicians said, well, we should be able to kind of extract the same kind of rigor out of philosophy. And philosophy is too full of this mumbo jumbo, mushy bullshit. Let's get rid of that stuff and let's model philosophy on science and on mathematics. So I think you're right. I think that's explicitly part of the history of analytic philosophy, was that kind of effort. And I think it's an experiment that needed to be done, and had to be done. I'm glad people did that. I just sometimes wonder if the after effects were sort of tragic, some of them, but one of the things I remember, I wish Joseph was here because this was part of what he was talking about. One of the things I remember one of the first classes I took, my very first semester, was a class on Carnap and Heidegger. And it was a brutal introduction to philosophy, because I had never studied much philosophy. But these two guys are kind of on opposite sides. I mean, like as far away as you can get on the continental analytic divide. Carnap was part of the Vienna Circle, and he was one of the architects of logical positivism that kind of precipitated from Wittgenstein and Frege and Bertrand Russell. And my recollection is that what happened, like we read the book by Carnap, I forgot the Aufbau, which is one of the words in the German title. It's called like the structure of the world, the logical structure of the world. But what he tried to do is he tried to separate syntax and what's the other S word?
Semantics?
There you go. Syntax and semantics. And so syntax was supposed to be the logical structure, and that you could analyze with logic. And so you could literally reduce the structure of all linguistic statements to a formalism. And so then you could get this very rigorous, precise, logical formalism that was the syntax of the world, even. But then you had to link it up with the semantics, the semantics was basically the content. So you have this formalism, to put it, I mean, this is Mickey Mouse, but if P is true, then Q is true, and P is true, therefore Q is true. And you create these valid logical structures that you can say, now, if language doesn't follow these, any language that doesn't follow this, we can toss out because it's not valid. And then the next step then is to try to then load that with content, like to fill in the P's and the Q's and the stuff with statements that describe, I guess to use Wittgenstein's language, the actual states of affairs in the world. And then the question is now, are those sound? When you put that information in, you get true statements. But the problem was, at least from what I remember from this class, the reason logical positivism eventually collapsed was because you could show no necessary connection between the syntax and the semantics. That that you say there is this syntax, but then in order for it to really describe the world, you have to load it with information about the world. But there was no way to show a necessary connection between the two. And throwing data in from the world just seemed to be like almost arbitrary. And so there was this rift between semantics and syntax that, as far as I know, logical positivism was never able to bridge. And so my recollection is that was the collapse of logical positivism, and then what we know of as analytic philosophy sort of grew up from the ashes of that collapse. And I think this thing that I was talking about with Wittgenstein trying to occupy this space between realism and skepticism, I think that's the tension that the author in this article is talking about. Is there's this tension between a logical formalism and the ability to describe a real world, that's difficult to bridge.
Yeah, and that I years ago when I was in graduate school, we had a psychotic professor in one of our PhD required classes, and so he would say to us, "You have to do a 20-page paper," and he put up like 10 different categories or 10 different topics. And so a friend of mine and I we were just watching the zoo when people were trying to pick it. And we just said, okay, we'll pick mathematics. Well, what in God's name are two international relations PhD students going to say about, effing mathematics? And so, and I remember talking about the problem I had to my mentor, Nick Onoff, and he said there was a mathematics professor at Harvard who was extraordinarily well respected. He never spoke ever hardly at a faculty meeting. And they were arguing, the faculty was arguing about language requirements. Modern language requirements, whatever. And he just stood up and he said, mathematics is a language. And it was just, and so, I mean, there is, I don't want to say a logic, but there is a certain structure to different languages that I think that's why when people play around with them in poetry or in literature, or, think of someone like, why am I forgetting the author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland?
Lewis Carroll.
Lewis Carroll, he'll create these sentences and we can say, oh, that's a noun and that's a verb, even though he totally created those words, right? Those words didn't exist before he wrote it. And because we can recognize the patterns, we can recognize sentence structure. And so, it is interesting to me that, all languages have certain, for lack of a better term, structures, and yet they're so different from each other. But it seems to me, even though they can grow potentially, there still is an forgive me, inner logic.
Yeah, and I think that's what he was leaning towards in the Tractatus, but I think what he came to is that there's the ideas and concepts are neither right nor wrong in the sense that they correspond to nature or some type of objectional value, natural science, or mathematics. The example I like and that I'm using for our YouTube follower, if you're there, Rose, is the idea of how, like, let's say a botanist defines a rose and says that the botanist has delineated what a rose is and what we mean by rose. But then Wittgenstein says that when you start understanding language in this idea of how it delimitates to nature and how mathematics delimitates to nature, it's a very narrow understanding and of what the concept or the meaning is. It kind of restricts the idea to a form of classification. And the use of the word goes well beyond simple classification. For example, when you do say rose-colored glasses, or he came out smelling like a rose, the concepts employed here are related to the botanical classification of rose, but extend well beyond the simple classification of rose. And again, for him, the concepts stand or fall based on use. In the language game, the social construction is how that use is determined. Like a concept by itself, like a method of measurement, like if I had a ruler which had nothing but Greek abbreviations on it, doesn't really assert anything. The word of how I use that Greek ruler has to be used in a culture, in a language, in a scenario for it to really assert anything whatsoever. So it kind of goes back into that component of like the existence or non-existence of something. The empirical question, it's not an empirical question, it's a conceptual one.
I'm sorry to do this to Ed and Jackson, but I wanted to repeat, since you were not here when I said this real briefly, Joseph, that this is based on a class I had in graduate school, but that the logical positivism that was one outcome of this work of Frege, Bertrand Russell, and Wittgenstein. One of their tenets was that you could separate the syntax from the semantics of language, and the syntax. And I'm thinking this was Carnap, who was part of the Vienna, one of the members of the Vienna Circle, but that Carnap said you could have this syntax that had a strictly logical structure that you could reduce to logical formalism. And by logical formalism, I mean literally like just letters and symbols, like the formalism you see occasionally in the Trochtatus. And then once you have the logical semantics established, you could determine what sentences could be valid and which ones weren't, because you wanted to use sentences that were logically valid syntactically. But that logic has no content. It's just literally a bunch of symbols. And so in order for it to have meaning, you have to import semantics into it. You have to load those variables and those symbols with words and statements and context that then gives it meaning and can express facts about the world. But the problem was with logical positivism is the semantics and the syntax, they showed no way of necessarily joining those two. And that the loading the semantics, the meaning into the logic seemed to be just an arbitrary operation with no logical necessity to it. And so there was this fracture between the semantics and the syntax that, as far as I know, logical positivism was never able to bridge. And again, I think logical positivism collapsed and disappeared because of that. And then analytical philosophy arose from the ashes of that. But what your description of what Wittgenstein was doing in the philosophical investigations, I'm wondering if that's partially his reaction to that problem, recognition of that problem, and saying, yeah, you're right, that's not going to work, because you can't just sort of arbitrarily load the logic with data, with statements, and somehow come up with an accurate description of the world. You have to actually look at the way language is embedded in its real usage in actual communities, and that this breaking apart of the logic and the content, it just creates this unbridgeable gap that you can never get over.
Yeah, yes, it would be like when you have these formulas of prepositions and breaking the sentence down, and we have these rigid conceptual structures, and it can lead to a false picture and a barrier that if you don't start examining the practice, it will not make any sense. For example, I can give you a sentence that makes complete structural sense, but has no meaning. The earth is as flat as the color red. Everything I'm saying there is logically consistent with a sentence, and you could plug it into a formula, but somehow I got the words confused and mixed up. But straight in, we can go into the empiricism of what red is and what flat is, but that doesn't help us. And the logic itself doesn't really help us, because the sentence has a subject, it has a preposition, it has everything structurally that makes sense. But the only way we're going to find out what I mean by that, or how I got those words confused, is in the practice and in the language game of that culture. So it's very, very similar with what you're saying, because he, in later days, because he was asked to join the logical positivists and lead them and be their fearless leader, and his way of telling them no, because he was quite an odd duck, was to read obscure Indian poetry with his back to them. And
that was
Wittgenstein, when the group of logical positivists wanted him to lead him. He was like, his way of being very clear about being no was to stand up in the crowd with his back to them and read Indian poetry about subjective experience. And they were like, this is godsend, he's a leader, this is what. And he's like, oh, for sakes, no. He didn't want anything to do with them, because when you start having these rigid conceptual structures, they give you a false picture and become a barrier in their own way.
I put this in the chat, but I wanted to mention that Lewis Carroll was a mathematician and logician. And I think part of the game he's playing is what you were describing, that you can construct these sentences that are formally correct, but are just absolutely absurd. And, I think that was part of what Lewis Carroll was doing, is playing with language in exactly that way.
I love him. He's so everything about Lewis Carroll is amazing.
Can I ask a question that's way, way unfair? You mentioned, Joseph, you actually have read Lewis. I don't remember if it was Adventures in Wonderland or Through the Looking Glass, but there was a short segment of Alice's journey where she rows a boat out offshore and talks to the mock turtle. And that is one of the most depressing scenes in literature I've ever read, but I'm not a Carroll scholar. And if anybody else had read it, because it still lingers with me, and it's been over 30 years since I read it. I read it as a grad student. And I mean, the mock turtle won't stop crying. And Alice is trying to deal with and to say, well, I don't know, it's not so bad, or what can I do to help? And he's saying, oh, well, and it is, and geographically in the novel, it's away from everything else, right? It's offshore. He's on this little island, on this rock, really. And I don't know if you remember that scene.
I vaguely remember it, and I think it was Through the Looking Glass. And the only reason I remember is because I have an emotional state identification of reading that and getting really depressed. So that's about it.
Well, then I'm not the only one. Okay. But maybe Mock Turtle, looked inside the universe and said it all means nothing. So he couldn't handle it. Thank you for that aside.
Oh yeah.
I wished I remember. I read those to my kids years ago and had this nice illustrated version that had these side notes that would explain some of the mathematical and logical significance of some of the stuff he said, but it's been too long. I don't remember enough. Jackson looks like
you're really quiet. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, Jackson sounds like earlier, a while back, he was like, and then I just kept on blah. So I was wondering what he wanted to say.
No, nothing. I'm just vibing, Today's meeting went well. I think we have some great candidates for our next book. I was going to say I do need to leave now, unfortunately, to go get some dinner and do my laundry. I know. Poor me.
What's dinner tonight?
Don't know. I figure it in the moment. Let's see what we're talking about. Logical positivism. No, that won't help me at all.
Mock turtle soup.
Mock turtle soup. That's what's for dinner. Thank you, Nevin. All right. Ciao. Bye.
Take care, Jackson. Bye.
See you Tuesday.
See you then.
Is it that late?
Is it? Are we going till 7 or are we going till 8? Because I was thinking of signing off around 7:30 because I didn't think how we could go into 2 hours of this one article. I didn't know.
I'm okay. Anyway, whatever works. I was just skimming through it, see if there's anything else.
Well, I thought what y'all were talking about made a lot of sense.
I will, and I do. I can't. I just find him really fascinating, especially the aspect of the beetle in the box, where language is a construct of society. And
Why
I
don't you
mentioned,
explain that, because I actually don't remember that or understand it. I know you and Eric bat that around. So what's the beetle in the box thing?
it's to show that language is a social construct, and it's a thought experiment he had where he said, imagine everybody gets together and inside their box is a beetle, and nobody's ever seen a beetle, and nobody knows what a beetle is like, and nobody can look inside each other's box, but they have to come up with words to describe a beetle where they can kind of have a common language to describe a beetle. And inside my box could be like a Statue of Liberty. Inside your box could be something completely different, like a piece of pizza, but we're all agreeing that this is a beetle. So we come up with these ideas of what a beetle is. And it's a way to show how like there's an all of those relative experiences that we have inside our own box, our own personal experience, does somehow get constructed into a social construct of a language game, but doesn't necessarily represent what's inside the box or what a beetle is. It kind of goes into the complexity component of reference theory. Like in reference theory, there seems to be an idea that an object is synonymous with an object, and that a name is synonymous with an object, and it kind of baptizes that object, and that name accurately reflects what is in that object. Whereas what Wittgenstein was saying is that there's a lot of personal experience and relevancy and fluidity that go into the naming convention and the construction of an idea or a concept. And when we do that, we're agreeing that we've all have this understanding of a beetle is, and we're going to take this understanding of a beetle and we're going to transpose it into every other situation. But really it's relative experience that is only a dim shadow of what a beetle is for us in our box represented in that given language game. In the philosophical investigations, I think it's like section 72 or something, goes into like, what are the simple components of a chair? I mean, when I say chair, am I meaning a chair with 3 legs? Am I meaning a chair with 2 legs? Am I meaning, am I getting down to the subatomic level where I have wood in that chair? Does the chair have to have a cushion? Does it not have to have a cushion? There's so much layers of abstraction to reference theory that there's really no way that you can just take something and put a logical requirement on it like he did in the Tractatus. It creates its own prison in a way. We have to kind of get into what the group is saying in their own language game and see it on the basis of that culture and that environment, try to make sense of it so that it can be said, and then and understand it in that environment, in that context only, rather than trying to transpose these ideas that we have, these pre-existing concepts, and make them universally applicable to everywhere. Which is why some critics actually argue that he's more of a relativist, and that everything Wittgenstein is arguing is some form of relativism, and that there can't be any concrete fact. But I don't think that's the case. I think what he's saying is that there has to be a fluidity in the words and the concepts we define in the context of where they're defined. They can't just be rigid. The moment you start adding absolute truth and rigidness to it, you're creating its own set of problems. So he certainly was an advocate of personal development, but he felt that those things are really things that you need to personally work on. That's why in the Tractatus, like everybody thinks when he says that which we cannot speak, we must remain silent. He's not saying just shut up about metaphysics. It's more like there are certain personal experiences and relevancies that you have that being silent about and developing them individually is more important than trying to construct a concept or an idea behind them. Aesthetics, ontology, religion, these are all very personal experiences that really can't be formalized in any kind of rigid system where you're proving a belief. It's your experience. But there are some things that we can kind of deconstruct in the language games to get a little bit of a hint of what a Beatle is in that box that we're all coming to terms with through this social construct of language. Sorry, I talked way too long.
What it sounds like to me is he's accepting a sort of basic solipsistic claim in that I only have access to my mental states and you only have access to your mental states. And then a theory of construction of meaning that has to do with something like intersubjective negotiation. One of the fundamental mysteries in phenomenology, the way Husserl put this problem was, they sort of accepted this basic idea that the only thing, going all the way back to Hume and Descartes, that the only thing I have access to are my own subjective conscious states. That's it. I don't have any immediate access to any objective world outside my own mental perceptions. And then the question, Husserl's question was, well, then how do you get objectivity from subjectivity? I mean, the sort of reductionist, which a lot of analytical philosophers are into, but the sort of reductionist materialist view is the opposite. It's, well, we know there's a material world. How do you get subjective consciousness out of a material world? But the phenomenologist said, you don't have any immediate access to a material world. The only thing you have immediate access to are your conscious states. And so Husserl said, no, the question isn't how you get subjectivity out of an objective world. It's how do you get objectivity out of a subjective world, out of a collection of subjective worlds. And he ended up with a kind of Kantian transcendental philosophy. But it sounds like Wittgenstein, I mean, your description of the Beatle box makes it sound to me like he's working on a similar problem. How do you get not objectivity, but how do you get a common world out, among people who are sort of locked into their own subjective experience? And the way you do that is through, like you said, these sort of linguistic games of negotiating meaning. So for example, if the thing that I have in my box looks like a piece of pizza and the thing that you have in your box looks like a knife, and then we say, well, let's use this knife to cut this piece of cheese, and I cannot cut this piece of cheese with my pizza, then that suggests that we're actually not talking about the same kind of thing. And so then we need to renegotiate what we mean by knife. And it sounds like that like he's working on a similar problem that Husserl is, but rather than saying that there's these transcendental structures, it's more of a negotiation process, something like that.
Yeah, I would, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ed.
No, are you sure? Because
No, yeah, just to go ahead, please.
I wasn't, I don't know if it would be a negotiation, but rather multiple common intersubjective experiences or understandings. Does that make sense? So it's not like, well, I'll give you that meaning if you give me this meaning, but rather, if we do have, I gave a really simple example in my class yesterday when I said, think of the expression, he's out. And I said, what are the multiple different meanings of that very simple statement, he's out? And someone said baseball, that he was, tagged out or someone. And I said, yeah, baseball's a good example. What's another one? Well, he's not here, right? Yeah, that's right. And the other one was, and because they're younger, it was like, well, yeah, he's out. I said, you mean out cold? You mean he passed out? Because of controlled substances. Yeah, and so each of those are legitimate answers, right? Each of them are correct, but they're not. What's the word I want to use? But they don't. No one answer reflects the totality of all the potential meanings for that statement.
Yeah, when you start attaching precision to those meanings, it loses its flexibility. and that creates its own problems, because I think that's what he's saying the Tractatus was, is that it was a attempt at logical precision to the point where it became its own prison. And to borrow Kantian terms, I think and I want to be careful about saying this. I think Wittgenstein's project is to examine the various kinds of statements that we can make about phenomena, and then what is derived from that in a group is what I think would be a good way to describe his project. Now, I don't know where Kant and Wittgenstein would converge, but I think what Wittgenstein's really clear about is that he's not trying to arrive at preconceived concepts and come to his own ontology or solipsism or whatever it is. He's trying to examine the various kind of statements we can make about phenomena, and then how that can kind of deconstruct our language so that we can kind of make our way out of the labyrinth of all of these other preconceived notions.
Yeah, I'm not sure pneuma would be a good word, because
Phenomena, not noumena, phenomena.
Oh, okay, phenomena.
Yeah, not noumena. Did I say noumena? I'm sorry.
Well, no, that's what yeah. So the reason I said the solipsism thing is, I mean, I think, the way it just, the example to me, again, I have not even read the investigation, so I don't know, but that sounds like the kind of picture I get from this article, is that's the kind of thing that's going on. And the reason I said the solipsistic thing is because unless you go with some kind of phenomenology, and I don't have any reason to think that Wittgenstein is, maybe he is, but it seems like Hume is right that we only have access to our own subjective consciousness, because, and here's the illustration I use in class. Even if you accept a contemporary reductionist, materialist explanation of consciousness, and you say consciousness is a function of the brain, or the brain and the nervous system or something. So let's say you're a materialist and you accept that. Well, then what happens when I experience this bottle? Well, according to that story, my nerves encode temperature and pressure data into neurochemical signals that then travel, down my nerves and go into my brain, and light bounces off things and goes into my eyeballs, and then my eyes convert that into electrochemical data. And so all the brain gets is a bunch of data. It gets a bunch of neurochemical signals. It does not get a bottle. That's why I say this is not a bottle. It's a mental representation of a bottle. And that's, I tell them that's why you can have movies like Inception or The Matrix, because, in The Matrix, you plug a jack into the back of the brain, and the computer and those wires hijack the electrical signals coming from your nerves and inject a different set of signals. But the point is that consciousness is forever broken from the world. We have exactly zero access, unmediated access to a physical world, zero, unless you go through some phenomenological approach. So that's what I mean, that that's why Hume says the only thing I have access to are my mental perceptions. That's it. I literally have no unmediated access to a world outside my mental construct. And so I don't live in the world, I live in a mental model. And I assume that the mental model I live in is identical to the world, but clearly it's not, because there are times when my mental model and the world don't match up and weird shit happens. And so that's what I mean in the solipsistic thing. So if I'm thinking of that like this, that I have these experiences and I have these names and these concepts and these ideas, and then other people have that, they have their own mental models, and then we interact with one another, and we have to through use, to use Wittgenstein's things, through the way I use things, we come to mutual agreement about what this is and how it functions in the world. But, I mean, I heard this story. I need to get the reference to make it actually more reliable, but that when Native Americans first saw ships, large sailing ships coming to the shores, they thought they were monsters or something, because because they could see people, but they had canoes, but they had never seen anything like this. And so that was not a giant canoe. It was not a ship. It was like some weird sea monster that, was being ridden by people or was consuming people. But because there was they had no place for that in their world. And so what they actually experienced was not a ship or a giant canoe. It's kind of like you were saying, with the Welsh fantastical creatures, they experienced something else. And it wasn't until they begin to have conversations and interactions with these people, and then went and walked on the ship and so on, that they begin to, where the models, their mental models begin to sort of converge, and they could talk about things and make sense of what ship means. But that's kind of why that's what I mean by the solipsism. We're sort of caught up in these subjective worlds, and then those subjective worlds are then in conversation with other people in my culture. And so we have these cultural references that we all share, because we've, each of our mental worlds have been in this process of engagement with other people's mental worlds within a particular cultural context over time. I mean, that's kind of the sense I get of what Wittgenstein's describing.
Yeah, I agree with you. The funny story, Russell would get so frustrated with Ludwig because Russell would write, like, he couldn't get Ludwig to kind of like agree to his full-on solipsism aspect of personal relevancy. So he would write like 3 dots on a piece of paper and hold it up to Ludwig and be like, can you at least agree this exists? And Ludwig would be like, well, I can agree that we're in this, talking about it. Is that what you mean? He's like, no, I don't want anything to do with you. So for Wittgenstein, when you drop the logical requirements of an object, that, because the object itself becomes irrelevant. It's more of the conceptual apparatus of talking about it, like you said, where the practice is more important than the abstraction. So it's really easy to kind of read the Trochtatus and kind of put him in the camp of this solipsistic hell. But it is, in a way, like, again, the conceptual apparatus, the use dictating the meaning, and the object being irrelevant, as I think is what he's trying to get at. Apparently there's a movie with him. Eric keeps trying to get me to watch it, and I keep forgetting. I'm gonna watch it. I should do that tonight.
Movie on Wittgenstein?
Yeah, there's like a movie where like, and I can't remember the title of it, where like, he's it kind of embodies his quirky behavior. He's like, I was flipped off by a cyclist today, so I'm going to commit suicide. And Russell was like, okay, well, before you do that, would you like to get some wine, maybe some cheese? Because it's like the 6th time I've heard you do this. So he was such a unique, quirky individual. Like Jonathan, what's the economist? I can't say, is it Keynes?
Oh, John Maynard Keynes.
Keynes met him on a train ride to Cambridge, and he wrote to his wife in a letter. He was like, I just met the quirkiest fellow on the train, and I'm pretty convinced I just met God. So I was like, what happened on that train? Because I just would love to have been a fly on the wall for that, because he was such a goofy, very introspective person from a biographical standpoint, that I think that would have been just something really cool to behold.
Wasn't he quite tortured too, though? I mean, psychologically?
He had struggled with depression and sexual identity. he depression and loneliness. I think by our standards today, we would say he suffered from severe depression, and also kind of an aspect of a sexual identity, or because I think the only time we really ever see a photo of Ludwig smiling is when he's with Francis. I can't remember his last name, and it's kind of like I think that was his only really true love, was Francis Spinner, I think was his name, because you see him actually smiling. Everywhere else he doesn't smile, but when he's walking with him, he's smiling. And there's letters where he's talking about how when he had died, I believe in the war, Francis had died in the war, part of his soul went away too. So I think he was a very tortured soul. He struggled with suicide ideation and depression quite a bit. Yeah, very unique individual. He built a house. His sister asked him to work with a very renowned architect whose name I can't remember, and he took 2 years to build this house. And the architects, I think they went through 10 architects because they just wouldn't work with him. He'd spend 6 months on a window or a door frame, and they were like, "We're done. We're out. This is ridiculous. This guy, this is crazy." So I'd like to see the house someday.
Yeah, homophobia really messed up a lot of creative people.
Yeah.
I watched a movie, I don't remember much about it now, a while back, about Turing. I forgot his first name.
Alan
Turing, yeah, the mathematician who was really instrumental in the development of computer models. And
yeah,
he had a terrible life because he was gay.
Just the loneliness of not feeling like you can connect with someone. I mean, that's just got to be its own fresh hell.
And then if people find out, then the social ostracization. And I think didn't they gave him hormones or something, or I've forgotten what.
Yeah, he was actually somebody who had came over to his house, stole something from him, and so he called the police because there's been a theft. And Turing, this would have been, I want to say, the 1950s, where there still were draconian anti-homosexuality laws.
Wasn't it a crime then?
Yes.
It was
yes,
yeah.
It was a crime. And
Mm.
so they gave him hormonal treatments, and he died of poisoning, and people aren't sure if that was his way of committing suicide. But yeah, it's ridiculous. And but that's why if you look at so many African countries, especially former British colonies, they were becoming colonies at the time that Britain was putting in these anti-gay legislation. And so it was like they don't even, it's like the African countries aren't even asking themselves, well, if we're rejecting all of colonialism, why are we accepting these laws on sexuality that Britain gave us? And remember, in the United States context, I don't know if you ever heard of a loon named Anthony Comstock. Comstock was a one-man morality brigade who literally traveled the United States saying, there should be no information on abortion, on birth control. And it went all the way over to Nevitt, you might be old enough to remember the older term for sex toys, marital aids.
Oh. Yeah.
Marital aids. And literally it was against the law to give anybody information, even married couples, information on birth control. And these laws, many of them were still on the books in the 1960s, even though they had been passed roughly in the 1890s. In fact, go ahead.
Things like sodomy were illegal even among married people.
Yes, in fact, there's a court case where a husband performed cunnilingus on his wife, and then the next day he gets up, goes to work, and then she decides she really is really pissed off, so she calls the cops.
Wow.
Yes, and so the cops say, hey, did you do this? Yeah, she's my wife. Yeah, I did it. I enjoyed it. What the hell? He was found guilty.
Wow.
And after he got out of jail, he obviously divorced his wife. But don't you remember the case that was very important, Lawrence versus Texas? It was the first time that the Supreme Court said that anti-sodomy laws are unconstitutional. But what was amazing about it is half the states explicitly said people of the same gender committing sodomy was illegal, but another half a dozen states said we don't care what the gender is of the participants, it's illegal. So and sodomy in common law and statutory law in the United States means anything that is not genital to genital.
Wow. Jeez.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I always find it hilarious when this moralism for getting into people's bedrooms is usually done by hypocrites that are like one of the most reprobate, not like sex with non-consenting individuals. Because, like me personally, I'd rather have my kids babysat by a cross-dressing nun than a priest, but that's just me. So,
Well, and again, it's like, oh, these people say, oh, well, government's too oppressive, but you're going to tell me what I can do in my own home?
Really? I mean,
And
that's my thing is,
Yeah.
what the hell are you doing telling people what they can do in their bedroom? I mean, my God.
yeah, it's crazy.
Do you know a number of states, though, still have the laws on the books? They refuse to repeal them, even though they can't be enforced.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Isn't Texas trying to recriminalize same-sex marriage now?
I'm sure there's some loons that are trying to do it. Yeah.
Well,
Sorry, I didn't mean to get in a tangent there, but this was
no,
like
I was really willing, ready and willing to run down the path. So
yeah, I mean, because it's just one of those things with Wittgenstein where it's like I think it's so romantic to see him with Francis Skinner, and it makes me smile. But then it's like you smile and you're simultaneously sad at the same time. It's like, oh, so.
well, the iconic pictures of Wittgenstein, and maybe there's actually only one or two that keep getting recycled, but God, he just looks terrible. I mean, he just looks like he's in terrible pain and suffering.
Yeah, he was depression was a big one. He was just so idiosyncratic. He didn't last long. He went to a monastery once and he was like, this is it. This is my home. I want to be here. I want to be a monk. And the monks were like, no, I don't think so, buddy. You can stay here as long as you like, but you're not home. And I'm asking for his, he made a list of 100 words when he was a grade school teacher, where he kind of like formulated, he wanted to do a study of the language game as a grade school teacher, to like when the brains were being formulated. So he kind of like listed the most 100 meaningful words. It's called like Wittgenstein's Dictionary, or Wittgenstein's 100 Words. And I'm asking for a hardback copy of that for Christmas. But I still love when he was one of the reasons he got fired as a grade school teacher was when I can't remember what he asked the student. He was like, who wrote the book of John? And the student said, Jesus. And Wittgenstein it's like paused, looked at him, and slapped the book on his head, and pages went everywhere. And they're like, you can't do that, dude. And he got fired. So.
Yeah, I heard he was not a patient teacher.
I don't think he was. But I would love to read Philosophical Investigations with you guys and get your insight. I mean, some people say it's a little boring, but I think it's because it's really strange in that there's not really any overarching structure. It's more him just writing his thoughts down in this book and numbering them. But the one I really liked, I have it here. There's some secondary text I can recommend for reading it when you guys, if you want it, like when we were reading Hegel, Kalkovich was really helpful to me. John Ross was really helpful to me in reading Philosophical Investigations, and AC Grayling was as well. So I'll put that in the Discord.
Well, I only got this from the article that Nevitt you gave us to read. But the way the author of the article on Wittgenstein described Philosophical Investigations, it reminded me the content or how it was written, how it appears on the page reminded me of Nietzsche.
Oh yeah, gay science. Yeah, it does kind of have that structure. You're right. I didn't even think of that. Good observation, Ed.
Well, you know, I've got a copy of it here, and I don't like I said, I've never read it, but so I didn't know this, but
He's gonna knock. Is she knocking it down?
no, she just climbed. Well,
Oh, okay.
it's wobbly. It's not stable.
Oh, okay.
So she was
Okay.
just
All
climbing
right.
it.
No, it's like I don't want it to fall. I like how
Um,
Dean's just like, get out of here. I don't want to.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But since there's two parts, and the second part, I mean, it sounds like they're pretty much independent of one another.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking, oh, this is also a dual language, is why it's so thick. But the one, this is part one, and it's German English both, and so it's really like half that.
Gotcha.
Anyway, yeah, this is, I don't know, I got this many years ago. Is it I guess this just the Anscombe translation?
Anscombe with Hacker and Schult.
So, but even if we tried to do the whole thing, it's really half that, since this is a dual translation.
Yeah.
So that doesn't sound like a terrible, I mean, that sounds like something we could do in a semester, as opposed to the the phenomenology, which you can't really do we couldn't do in one session.
No.
So what I was thinking initially was maybe we could just do the first half, or just part one, but I have forgotten that this was a dual translation, so it's really half this length. But anyway, we'd have to ask the others. I noticed if you look at the lists, it shows up on 2 or 3 of our lists, but not everybody. So, you know, we could propose it, and I have a long list of books, that philosophical classics, that I want to read, that I've never read, and I just, you know, feel stupid that I've not read them. And I mean, that's one of the reasons for wanting to read this book, is just because it's an influential philosophical classic. So
yeah, I think that, and yeah, at some point Heidegger is up there for me, because I need help with Heidegger. I want to read him too. I really would be interested in reading Philosophical Investigation with you guys, and then at some point I got to just trudge through and try to make my way through Being in Time, because I tried doing it on my own, and the secondary literature Chase gave me I think is going to be a lot more helpful, because when I was on my own, I was just like trying to read Hegel without Kalkovich. I was like, I am so confused.
I some years ago, the political science, well, really the many departments within liberal arts created a 2-sequence graduate courses. I don't want to say great books, because that's demeaning it, but trying to take very disproportionately important literature, not only philosophy, but also literally literature, Crime and Punishment or something, and divided it in 2. So roughly the beginning of time until the early modern era, and then the early modern era. And so I taught it a couple times with a modern language professor, Kathy Jaffe, who was very enjoyable. But let me look up my notes from that, because what we did for Heidegger, because we thought Heidegger was important enough, that we had the students read smaller. There are actually a couple of smaller works of his that are more article length, and we thought that would be an entree in a way that a book couldn't, given the nature of the course. And one of them that I know we had them read, Nevitt, you may know of it. There's 3 people. I'm saying people, they're not people, but 3 people talking. History, philosophy, and theology, I think, are the 3 are having a conversation as they take a walk.
And that's by Heidegger?
That's by Heidegger, yeah.
Huh.
I think the 3 are history, theology, and philosophy.
I'm not familiar with that one.
But let me look it up, and I'll send it to all of you, or at least I'll send you the titles, and that way, you can. And if we want us to, and if you think it better to go into a longer text of his, I'm open to that too.
Yeah.
Well, a couple of years ago, I don't think anyone in the present group was there. We we did a seminar on this book, History of the Concept of Time, which is kind of there's several books that he wrote that were kind of precursors to Being in Time. So that would be another possibility. I've got a couple others, like The Basic Problems of Phenomenology, Phenomenological Interpretation of Kant. So there's some other things that are shorter, but I would be game for Being in Time. The thing is, it would be one of those that we would have to spread over a longer period of time.
Yeah, if we could, because I think philosophical investigations might be better for something for us to like chunk into now. But if the group's up to it, I would love to try to stretch out reading Being in Time like we did Hegel.
Yeah, I've got the old translation and the new translation, but like the newer, the Stombaugh translation of Being in Time is still almost 400 pages long, roughly. And it's a hard 400 pages.
Yeah, I made it to 75 because I was like, I don't know what the guy's saying. So
yeah, I that class on Carnap and Heidegger, we were reading, we only read part 1 of Being in Time, and she was assigning us, like, I don't know, it was like 150, 200 pages a week. And I had never read this stuff before at all, anything like this. And I went to her office and I said, how am I supposed to read this? And how am I supposed to read this many pages for a week and make any sense of it? And she was this German woman, who had been educated in Germany and all this. And she said, well, you just kind of, read through it quickly and get the general sense of what's happening here. I'm like, I get nothing.
Wow, general.
I get nothing when I do that. I mean, when I read it really slowly and carefully, I get a little bit. And when I try to read it like that, I get absolutely nothing. So anyway, it was a real, God, was that an introduction to philosophy. And then that was the same class we were reading, the Aufbau by Carnap. And man.
Wow, baptism by fire. Holy crap.
Nevin, remember I told you about, and his name was John Richardson. He was, what I didn't like about him is, and it still rankles me, even though it's been decades. He decided that it didn't matter if the school had accepted people into the PhD program, he was going to review us to see if we passed his muster. But anyway, another assignment that I had to do individually in a week. Did you ever, I'm sure you've heard of Arnold Spengler's The Decline of the West. Okay, that fucking book is like 1,000 pages long. Okay, I had to write something on that to that prick in a week. Not like and that wasn't like that was the only class I had.
Oh man.
So I was reading hundreds of pages a day on The Decline of the West.
Man, what a nightmare. See what kind of things you get to look forward to, Joseph?
I'm excited. It'll be fun.
Well, I mean, to be honest, the class on Carnap and Heidegger, the woman who taught it was a very nice woman, and so she had people like me. I mean, it was literally my first semester in graduate school, and I never studied philosophy as an undergraduate. And so she had me, and then she had guys who were, like ready to graduate in the PhD program, all in the same class. And she actually, she scaled her expectations accordingly. So she wasn't the psychopath that Ed had, fortunately.
Yeah.
But, you might get a psychopath.
Who knows? Yeah, it'll be fun. Yeah.
But it'll give you stories.
Yeah, that's right. But you can tell stories, people.
Well, we'll definitely.
You can terrify potential graduate students.
Yeah.
Actually, in all seriousness, if you're really thinking going into a PhD program, realize that in your first year, everybody is going to try to get you to be interested in what they do. And that's a compliment. They think you have a brain, and they realize what they do is going to die unless new PhD students pick up part of what they do. That's how these conversations continue into the future.
Wow.
So for most people in their first year in their PhD program, they feel completely at sea. They're being pummeled by so much reading and so much conversations that you kind of get overwhelmed. But just realize your professors are doing that to you because they see something in you, and they want you to be part of their, I don't know what word to use, tribe. That's not the right word, but
That's not a bad word. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. And academic fields tend to be a little tribal, where, like you said, you've got these different people that are interested in analytic or continental, and then you've also got, even within those, that are, the Wittgensteinians and the Russellians, and like you said, people want to recruit you, so you can become part of their camp. And then, and in each one of those schools has their own publishing, their favorite publishers and stuff. And so, yeah.
Just imagining everyone describing the Russellians and Wittgensteinians, and then someone just is like, Kantians.
Yeah.
This
Fucking Kantians.
is the duty. Oh. Well, this has been a really good session. I always appreciate you guys. I look forward to this every Friday. So
oh my God. I just realized we have no idea what we're doing next week. Nobody else is here.
Well, can I I promise I can do it tomorrow. I can go to my office and see the shorter works on Heidegger, because those would be, and I'm not making fun of them by calling them shorter. I mean, but they are more digestible. And one is, and the conversation of history, philosophy, and theology is just, I don't want to call it fun, but you kind of almost see you do get a side of Heidegger that I don't think you see in other of his works. But the one, and I can't remember the other's title, which is very, very dense with his vocabulary. But I'll defer to you two about next week.
Yeah, whatever you guys want to go for. I guess we have to kind of bounce off the Discord server since there's very few of us here, but I'd say whatever you guys want to do, I'm game.
My only thing is I'm also, sorry for whining, but for this last part of the semester, I was hoping for things that were on the shorter side. So I don't know how long those Heidegger.
Well, let me do. What I'll do is, I promise I'll go to my office tomorrow morning and look it up, and then I'll email you and Joseph and just say, okay, and I'll give you the page length, so
Sure.
Yeah. And
Something dive into it so it's not too much. I'm sorry, guys. I really got to pee. Like,
Okay.
I had that iced coffee is like flying through me. Take care. Good seeing you.
See ya.
Okay. Does that sound okay, Nevitt? Because
that sounds good. Yeah.
You've got incredible grading. I can't imagine.
Incredible what?
Grading. You're grading.
Oh yeah, that's why.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got like 140 essays every time, and so anyway. But yeah, no, go ahead and send that to us, and then we'll take a look at that and get back. And since we were the only ones here, if the three of us like it, I think we should just say this is what we're doing next week.
Yeah. Well, there was a quorum, and the majority said.
Yeah, you're not here, you don't get a choice.
Right. That sounds more formal than you snooze, you lose.
That's right. Okay. We'll look forward to that then.
Okay. Thank you very much. Be safe.
Okay. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.